Before the Punic Wars, which made them famous, the Carthaginians stood as one of the most preeminent naval forces of their era. This was a legacy centuries in the making, which was built over many wars, often overlooked by history. Today, let us get to know these forgotten sailors of North Africa and the warships with which they forged a vast empire that nearly took down the Romans. This is the proud history of the Carthaginian Navy.
Naval history often takes a back seat in most discussions of the past, which is a shame considering its huge importance. If you'd like to broaden your horizons in this regard, I can highly recommend our sponsor Blinkist. Blinkist is an app that puts the vast library of human history at your fingertips. What's more, it takes thousands of non-fiction books and uses experts to distill them down to the most essential ideas for you to easily digest with text or audio in just 15 minutes. It's been a great tool for me to explore a wide range of topics from the 27 sections offered by Blinkist. As a great example, I was able to explore Sea Power by Admiral Tavridis, which covers the history and geopolitics of the world's oceans. As another follow-up to today's video, I listened to The Peloponnesian War by Donald Kagan, which is an excellent case study on the importance of naval operations in antiquity. I'm sure that when you try Blinkist, you'll be able to explore many hidden gems of your own. Right now, Blinkist has a special offer just for our audience. Click the link in my description to start your 7-day free trial with Blinkist and get 25% off a premium membership. Enjoy!
At its peak, the Carthaginian Navy was considered to be one of the most powerful sea powers of antiquity. This was the proud culmination of a long naval tradition dating back to their Phoenician forebearers in the Bronze Age. It was this group of cities along the coastal Levant which had first pioneered methods of navigation and ship construction that allowed them to dominate the seas prior to and even after the Bronze Age collapse of the 1200s BC. By the 9th century BC, Phoenicians had founded hundreds of outposts across the Mediterranean, which enabled the formation of lucrative trade networks that linked far-flung markets across the known world. Tradition holds that Carthage would be founded in 814 BC by the city of Tyre as a part of these endeavors. Strategically located at the nexus of east-west and north-south trade routes, it was almost inevitable that the city would rise to dominate the seas. Little is known about how this process occurred. Speculatively, we can assume that the heart of the early colony was its bustling port and merchant sector, capable of hosting dozens, if not hundreds, of ships of all sizes. Most would have been fishing or trade vessels. Yet it seems likely that at some point the young nobility of Carthage would have seen fit to begin equipping their ships for battle in the same manner as their Phoenician home cities with which they kept regular contact. While no outright wars are recorded in this period, there would still have been a need to combat piracy, to raid neighbors, and to establish naval superiority over rivals. By the 6th century BC, the power of the Phoenician mother cities began to wane as the silver trade collapsed and they were attacked by neighboring land powers. The western colonies were now on their own. It is at this point that Carthage would truly begin its rise to power. The upstart first began by shaking off the yoke of the local Libyans before next establishing regional dominance over Utica, Hippo-Acra, and other Phoenician settlements of North Africa. From here, the new city then began to look out across the Mediterranean, intent on claiming Tyre's old throne. Yet, whereas Tyre had dominated the colonies almost solely through economic pressure, Carthage began adding military force into the mix. Her navy became formidable and feared, and her army began seeing deployment in foreign lands. In these ways, Carthage established a new model of hegemony, which more closely resembled that of a traditional empire compared to the previous system under Tyre. Let us now take a closer look at the warships with which Carthage ruled the waves. Naval vessels of this period were galleys, meaning that they were narrow, shallow draft ships powered primarily by oar and backed by sails. Naturally, these evolved over time and came in all manner of shapes and sizes. We will briefly summarize the major classifications of warships and their role. Please note that while there is some debate in terms of how groups are defined, in this video we will be referring to the number of rowers per file, that is, the number of rowers in a cross-section regardless of their arrangement. The first class of ships were the monoremes. This is actually a hugely diverse group, which gets lumped together due to the fact that they all have a single bank of oars, generally with one rower per oar. As such, most merchant vessels dating back to the Bronze Age were of this type, with the Phoenicians and others merely adapting them for military use. The oldest and simplest monoreme warship was the Pentaconta. It measured around 30 meters long and 4 meters wide. As the name implies, it was powered by a total of 50 oarsmen, each of which manned the 48 rowing oars split between either side, or the 2 steering oars along the back. Early models had no top deck, and thus crew capacity was limited to just a few additional officers and marines. Later variants had partial or full decks, which further increased their capacity. Soon, new monoreme models such as the Lembus, the Hemiola, and the Laberna arose to complement or replace the Pentaconta. While monoremes would eventually be outclassed by larger warships, they were never rendered obsolete. Their simplicity, versatility, and long range meant that they would continue to be used for centuries to scout, patrol, raid, transport troops, and even fight in major battles. Eventually, naval innovators found that by stacking oar banks, often by way of outriggers, you could get more rowing power per linear foot of ship. By the 8th century BC, this is what eventually gave rise to the second class of warship, the bireme. Again, there were many variants, but overall, these vessels appear to have been 25 to 30 meters long and 3 meters wide. Thus, for the same relative dimensions of a monoreme, a bireme could now boast roughly 120 oars split between 2 sides. These would be manned by 120 rowers in addition to a few officers, sailors, and marines. While initially deployed as frontline warships, over time they would yield this position to larger vessels and take on support roles similar to those of the monoremes. The next class of ship was the trireme, which came to the fore around the 6th to 7th century BC. Such ships were roughly 37 meters long, decked, and had 170 oars split between 3 banks of rowing oars on either side and steering oars in the back. Total crew capacity is estimated at 170 rowers, 25 sailors, 5 officers, and about a dozen marines, including 2 archers. They could reach a high speed of about 8 knots and hold a steady 4 knots for long periods of time. Properly constructed and equipped, they would serve as fast and nimble warships. Triremes featured in virtually all major naval actions of antiquity and were the true workhorse of the period. Yet, by the 4th century BC, naval powers of the Mediterranean would begin fielding a new class of ship, the quadrireme. Reportedly invented by the Carthaginians, it was about 40 meters long, 5 meters wide, and featured 4 rowers per file. Whereas previous ships had followed the pattern of 1 man per oar, the quadrireme began to share oars between rowers who were typically distributed across 2 or 3 levels. This is believed to have occurred due to the fact that 4 independently operated oars would be impractical to build and even more difficult to coordinate. The shared oar approach allowed more manpower to be utilized whilst lowering the average skill required by each rower. Based on Rhodian records, they typically boasted 240 rowers, 25 to 30 sailors, and 5 officers, with a fighting complement of 19 marines, 6 archers, and 2 artillerymen. Many navies used them as their main frontline warship. However, the arms race between premier powers of the period also yielded an even larger ship, the quinquereme, apparently invented in 399 BC by Dionysius of Syracuse. It was 45 meters long, 5 meters wide, and featured 5 rowers per file. Their arrangement also used shared oars, this time spread across 3 levels in a 1-2-2 pattern. The Carthaginians apparently built their quinqueremes with a separated oar box for rowers, which improved ventilation whilst expanding the deck size and allowing the hull to be better reinforced. There were roughly 30 files on either side of the ship, for a total of 180 oars manned by 300 rowers. The total crew included about 25 sailors, 6 officers, 70 to 120 marines, and at times artillerymen. Fully decked, sitting 3 meters above the water, boasting a formidable complement of fighters, and at times sporting towers, quinqueremes were widely hailed as the premier warships of their time. Consequently, they formed the bulk of the Carthaginian navy at its prime. But how were these ships built? Understandably, construction was a massive endeavor, given the scale and complexity of such vessels. Timber needed to be felled, transported, and cut to size, while nails had to be made, rams cast, sails sewn, and on and on. Once components had been procured, assembly could begin. The hull came first, followed by the rowing benches, the rowing oars, the interior, the mast, the deck, the sails, the rigging, the steering oars, and the anchor. Finally, large amounts of work would also go into decorating the ship, including carvings, statues, painted eyes, and detailed bronze rams. Such a process was extremely labor-intensive and costly. Most first-rate powers had dedicated harbors and covered sheds for both construction and maintenance. In this regard, many of the Phoenician colonies were capable of significant production, while the Carthaginian naval facility, known as the Kothon, was a jewel of its time. Punic engineers further improved their means and methods by developing a proto-assembly line in which each piece of timber was cut to a universal size, marked for efficient construction. But once they were seaworthy, how were these warships staffed? As stated before, the vast majority of a ship's crew was its rowers, which could number up to 300 in the case of quinqueremes. During major battles like Ecnomus, the Punic fleet was said to have fielded over 100,000 rowers. To solve the colossal issue of manpower, Carthage sourced its crews from a variety of places. A large portion of the rowers probably came from the city of Carthage itself, while the rest were likely recruited from nearby islands and other Phoenician cities. In the ancient period, rowers were always free men who were probably recruited from the poorer citizens, as in Athens, and received a reasonable wage for their skilled labor. Marines, meanwhile, appeared to have followed the same model as the Carthaginian army, with some elements being drawn from the Punic citizenry, while many came from auxiliary and mercenary sources. Their equipment would have been similar to their land counterparts, though some alterations likely occurred given the unique nature of combat at sea. In later periods, it seems that Carthage had neither the want nor ability to provide the manpower required for its vast armies and navies, which led to increased outsourcing. For instance, mercenary Gallic helmets with Punic markings have been found amidst the seafloor wreckage of the Battle of the Agates Islands from the First Punic War. In other locations, private and mercenary sources seem to have provided entire ships or even squadrons. Once rendered fully operational, how were these warships trained? Unfortunately, little is recorded specifically about these Carthaginian practices. We know that they had a long naval tradition, which meant that sailors likely gained the requisite skills over the course of their daily lives. Specific training, such as rowing practice on land, is mentioned by the Romans, so perhaps something similar took place. Otherwise, the crews would likely have drilled along the shores of North Africa by exercising over long distances, learning to follow commands from their officers, and executing all kinds of maneuvers. Life in the Navy could be tough. Ancient warships were cramped spaces slicked with cold seawater, where hundreds of men rowed for hours with little awareness of their surroundings. Reprieve may be had when under sail, but ships had to make regular landfall to rest, cook, sleep, and resupply. This might occur at a port, but more often than not required the men to literally drag their ships ashore. It was a miserable experience, made only marginally better by wine and a simple high-protein diet at sea. In terms of organization, each ship had an overall captain with officers in charge of administration, navigation, observation, morale, and the timing of the rowers. Ship groups are less well documented, but it seems that squads of typically around 20 to 50 warships were commanded by a rabsheni or sub-general, while overall command of a fleet numbering sometimes in the hundreds would fall under a rab mahanet or general. Multiple combat and support fleets could be operational at a time across various theatres of the Mediterranean. This all would have varied based on what the situation demanded, and thus we should not expect much uniformity across the centuries. Details are sparse, but it's believed that in the height of its power, Carthage regularly kept a fleet of perhaps 120 or 130 warships, while this number often jumped to 200 or 300 in times of war. Administering such chaos fell to the large Carthaginian bureaucracy, which included bodies like the trireme that functioned as a senate, the Court of 104, which provided oversight, as well as various poorly understood commissions with more narrow focuses on things like taxes and perhaps logistics. When it came time for battle, the Carthaginian navy would have used a range of tactics. These were a reflection of the tools at their disposal, which included a ram, ranged weaponry, and marines. Let us review the ship-level tactics which accompanied each of these. Ramming tactics involved charging into enemy vessels using bronze rostrata located at sea level. This was a delicate matter. Charging head-on with another ship would be to attack its strongest point and would be suicidal for both sides. Thus, charging the weaker flanks was preferred. However, the angle of attack was critical. A perpendicular strike delivered the most force, but risked impalement or serious damage to one's ram. The ideal tactic was therefore to attack at a shallow angle, which would rupture a wide section of the hull. The impact was still traumatic for both sides, but far less deadly for the attacker. A highly skilled captain and his crew might even aim to strike a glancing blow that would shear off an enemy's oars. This would leave the opponent's vessel dead in the water, allowing for a deadlier follow-up strike, or better yet, the capture of a ship with minimal damage. During these operations, it might be the case that a charging warship would retract its oars prior to impact to avoid crippling itself. Replacement oars would also have been present on board. Ranged tactics involved using archers and artillery to fire upon an enemy vessel from a distance. Projectiles were most effective against ships with exposed rowers who might be picked off. Decks and various forms of cataphracting helped mitigate such threats and were relatively impervious to all but the most powerful of ship-mounted artillery. Overall, ranged weapons rarely destroyed a ship outright, but could certainly batter an enemy crew into submission or, at the very least, disrupt their operations. Small, fast vessels would focus on using superior maneuvering to win ranged battles, while large ships would rely on volume of fire. Compared to the previous two forms of naval warfare, boarding tactics were the simplest. They involved closing the distance and overpowering a foe in close quarters combat. To do so, ships would use grapples to hook their prey and then drop boarding bridges to charge across. Once linked together, the advantage often went to the ship with the largest contingent of marines, and so it's no surprise that quinqueremes capable of holding over 100 fighters were so formidable. But these were all ship-level tactics. What about the maneuvers of squads and fleets? It seems that the Carthaginians tended to favor ramming over boarding, and thus victory was a matter of attacking an opponent's flanks. To this end, tactics such as the periplus could be used to fix the enemy's front line while sending fast ships around the side to hit them from the exposed rear. This tactic might be countered by using terrain to deny an envelopment. The diekplus, by contrast, was a maneuver meant to pierce a battle line. The tactic was executed by sending a single ship into the gap between enemy warships. At the last moment, the captain would veer to the side and shear the oars off one of the opponent's ships, incapacitating it. A second warship would follow close behind and deliver a full-speed ram to the crippled boat. At this point, a tear would form in the enemy line, through which the rest of the attacking fleet would pour in and rip the opposition to pieces. This was often countered by the use of tactical reserves meant to plug any gaps that might develop. In addition to these standard tactics, the Carthaginians proved that novel stratagems were also possible. At the Battle of Ecnomus, for instance, they attempted an envelopment of the Roman fleet by giving way in the center and forcing their way around the sides. This tactic occurred 40 years before the Battle of Cannae and may have even inspired Hannibal's battle plans. Now let us finally turn our attention to the service history of the Carthaginian navy. This would have begun in the coastal waters of North Africa as the fledgling colony sought to establish local dominance. We have only a dim understanding of this period, though it's likely that naval battles were quite small, involving only a handful of ships. Soon, however, the Carthaginian fleet and its sphere of influence would expand across the Mediterranean. In doing so, they would start to compete with other naval powers of the era, such as the Etruscans and the Greeks. Around 600 BC, it seems that the Punic Navy was used to deploy forces overseas to occupy Ebusus in the Balearic Islands, and soon to secure control of Sardinia. No naval battles are recorded, and it seems this was instead a relatively unopposed move which helped Carthage secure its dominance over the seas of eastern Iberia and southern Gaul. Likely, this would have caused some friction with the Etruscan fleets which operated in the neighbouring Ligurian and Tyrrhenian seas. Though both had raided and traded with one another for decades, they would find common cause when it came to combating the growing Greek influence in the Western Mediterranean. Thus, the two would forge an alliance in 450 BC to oust the Phocians, who had recently established a new home in Corsica. At the Battle of Alalia, 120 Etruscan and Carthaginian warships faced off against 60 Greek vessels, all of which were likely monoremes or biremes. We are left with no tactical records of the battle and must imagine the carnage of the incident. Missiles flew, swords flashed, and hulls ruptured, all while men drowned in the churning seas. Herodotus notes that the Greeks lost 2/3 of their ships, winning a Pyrrhic victory, but ultimately being forced to abandon Corsica. In the aftermath, Carthaginians and Greeks would continue to clash in the surrounding seas. The island of Sicily became the nexus of these conflicts for over 2 centuries. It is in this theatre of war that the Punic fleet would see the bulk of its action. The first major campaign seems to have occurred sometime in the 6th century BC, when the semi-mythical King Malchus reportedly raised a force to invade. Few records exist, but it seems that this mostly amounted to a glorified raid, which involved capturing booty and slaves and sacking a number of coastal areas in the western regions, but without establishing direct rule. In 483 BC, the first true Punic Sicilian War would break out, when Carthage raised a host of allies aboard several hundred ships to oppose the Greek tyrants Theron and Gelon. The fleet faced little opposition at sea and was instead used to transport land forces for a series of pitched battles which culminated in the siege of Himera. Here, the Punic fleet was drawn ashore in a fortified coastal camp. The Greeks correctly identified this as the greatest threat and infiltrated the position for a surprise attack whilst a pitched battle was underway. In the ensuing chaos, many ships would be destroyed, making the eventual defeat and retreat of the Punic army all the more deadly. As had occurred during their initial advances, the survivors would be battered on the way home by another storm. Such were the vicissitudes of the Sicilian campaigns. There would be 8 more of these Punic Wars in Sicily, with increasing levels of military investment and resulting ferocity. We will not have time to cover them all in detail, but can give you a taste. Generally speaking, we see the Carthaginians deploying fleets in the hundreds, with each wave boasting greater proportions of new ships such as triremes, quadriremes, and eventually the hulking quinqueremes. These were often used for large-scale operations like invasions, blockades, and pitched battles. Yet they could also be used more flexibly for smaller operations like raids and lightning strikes. The Third Sicilian War against Dionysius of Syracuse provides an excellent case study. In the initial phases, the Carthaginians had but a fleet of 100 to delay the advances of the tyrant's force of 200 warships and 80,000 infantry. Soon, however, Punic reinforcements arrived, bringing their total to 300 warships and 50,000 infantry. Under the commander Himilco, this force was deftly used to outplay Dionysius. For instance, a landing at Cape Polorum drew out the Greek army from Messene, at which point a detachment of the Carthaginian fleet filled with picked rowers and marines quickly sailed around their rear to seize and sack the city. Soon after, the two sides would clash at sea in 397 BC at the Battle of Catana. Here, Himilco fielded some 200 triremes and 300 transports retrofitted with rams, while Dionysius deployed a mix of 180 triremes and the new quinqueremes. According to Diodorus Siculus, the naval battle began in the Greeks' favour when their admiral led a sudden sally of an elite force. However, he was ultimately driven to flight, leaving the rest of his fleet leaderless and disorganized in the face of the ensuing Carthaginian counterattack. Though the Greek quinqueremes were larger and far better manned than the Punic triremes, the smaller ships were able to lock them down with grapples and shoot, swarm, or ram them into oblivion. When the battle was finished and the Syracusan fleet crushed, the Carthaginians showed no mercy, sweeping along the coasts to kill any Greeks attempting to swim back to shore. Accordingly, the coasts of Sicily became choked with the corpses and broken timbers of the defeated navy. After the Third Sicilian War, the Carthaginians fought 2 more wars against Dionysius, and in these, the Carthaginian fleet proved invaluable. For instance, the capture of the Syracusan fleet at Eryx and the death of the Greek tyrant led directly to the end of the Fifth Sicilian War. In the next 2 Sicilian Wars, the Punic Navy continued to show its strength and versatility, with the fleet breaking into small squadrons of 20 to 50 ships, which brutally raided coastal cities and wreaked havoc on enemy shipping. By the 3rd century BC, the Carthaginian navy had justifiably attained a formidable reputation. When Pyrrhus of Epirus launched his invasion in 280 BC, Carthage would actually pledge 120 of its ships to support the Romans. When Pyrrhus turned on Sicily next, it was the Punic fleet which would help resist his advances, and eventually dealt him a punishing defeat upon his retreat back to Italy. But the ultimate withdrawal of this external force would leave Carthage and Rome on a collision course. The First Punic War, which kicked off in 264 BC, would primarily take place in Sicily between 2 asymmetric powers, the Romans excelling on land and the Carthaginians excelling at sea. Initially, this made for a rather inconclusive affair, as legionary advances across Sicily were stalled by a Punic blockade of the island, which choked their supply lines and allowed them to raid coastal Italy with near impunity. Eventually, the Senate would seek to break the impasse by raising their own navy, largely using allied Greek expertise, and reportedly by copying the design of a wrecked Punic quinquereme. In the ensuing battles along the coasts of Sicily, the Carthaginians were initially able to maintain the upper hand. However, the invention of the corvus changed the nature of combat. It was a spiked boarding bridge capable of being lifted, swiveled, and dropped on enemy vessels. This device made it far more difficult for Punic ships to use their superior maneuverability to evade the clutches of the Roman vessels, and essentially allowed the legions to transform naval combat into a land battle. With the playing field leveled, the Romans began to turn the tides and even planned a naval invasion of Africa in 256 BC. This would be contested by the Carthaginians at the enormous Battle of Egnomus, which featured almost 700 ships and 250,000 participants. It was here that the Carthaginians split their fleet in 3 to attempt to draw apart and envelop the compact Roman formation. The assaults on the wings were successful until a victorious Roman center was able to rally and relieve their beleaguered comrades, winning the battle. Over the course of the war, the Carthaginians fought back and were greatly assisted by a series of storms, which the inferior Roman sailors, weighed down by their corvae, were poorly equipped to deal with. Hundreds of ships would be lost along with many tens of thousands of lives. Yet, the stubbornness of the Senate meant that absurd amounts of money and bodies would be thrown into the conflict to rebuild after every loss and keep the war machine churning. The Carthaginians, by contrast, were unwilling or unable to devote the same levels of effort, and by the end of the war struggled to fully staff their navy. Yet they nonetheless put up a valiant effort, winning victories at the Battle of Drepana and Phintius, while proving their superiority in smaller-scale action like blockade running and raiding. It seems that by this time they had learned to better counter the corvus, which was simultaneously seeing less use owing to its associated risk during storms. In 241 BC, a final, climactic battle would be fought between both fleets at the Agates Islands. Here, the Carthaginians deployed 200 quinqueremes against the 250 of the Romans. The battle did not feature much in the way of noteworthy tactics and appears to have been a straightforward brawl. While the corvus was not used, it seems that the Romans were more capable in traditional naval tactics than when they had started the war, and, because they had stripped their ships for speed prior to battle, were said to now be able to get the upper hand against the understaffed and overburdened Carthaginian warships. Nonetheless, it was a bloody fight with heavy losses on both sides. Ultimately, the Romans emerged victorious. By this point, a thoroughly exhausted Carthage was ready to come to the peace table. The ensuing treaty would see them abandon Sicily and agree to massive payments over 10 years. This would prove to be the end of Carthaginian naval supremacy, yet their fight with Rome was far from over. While they never again took to the seas in the same numbers, the Carthaginians were quick to get their naval capabilities back online. For instance, it is believed that the Great Cothon Harbour was built around this time. The exterior harbour was likely its ancient port, which would be reserved for commercial use, while the new interior harbour would be dedicated to military use. It was surrounded by a double wall, inside of which lay dozens of ship sheds, capable of housing between 150 and 220 ships. Each ship shed was propped up by Ionic columns, giving the impression that the harbour was a grand portico, concealing the weapons of war that lurked within. In the middle of the Cothon, the Carthaginians built an island on which the Admiral's Tower was located, which oversaw both the facilities and the sea itself. From here, the admiral could direct all kinds of naval matters at Carthage, sending out fleets for offense or drawing a great chain across the entrance for defense. Over the course of the Second Punic War, the harbour would be the origin from which Carthage's military might was once again projected. While few pitched battles at sea occurred, fleets nonetheless helped supply and reinforce armies across many theatres of war. However, Roman victory at the Battle of Zama ultimately forced the surrender of Carthage with the punishing terms of peace, putting an end to Carthage's maritime empire. Nonetheless, Punic sailors once more returned to the seas to enrich themselves through trade. This prompted Rome to finally put an end to any dreams of an eventual return, with Cato ending every speech before the Senate with the admonition, "Carthage must be destroyed." The Third Punic War was finally waged to put the great city under siege. This was another brutal affair, which saw the remnants of the Punic fleet bravely partaking in sallies, raids, and blockade running. Ultimately, however, it was their home, the Cothon Harbour, which would become the focus of Roman assaults and the breach through which the city was stormed. Yet, while this would be the end of the Carthaginian navy, its legacy, and even its sailors would fight on under the new management of the Romans. I hope you've appreciated this deep dive into the woefully understudied affairs of ancient naval warfare, and in particular the long history of the Carthaginian fleet. What units of history should we cover next? A big thanks to the patrons for suggesting this topic and making this video possible through their continued support. A big thanks is also owed to the researchers, writers, and artists for bringing this episode to life. Be sure to like and subscribe for more content and check out these other related episodes. See you in the next one.